want the federal government getting more involved in the internet and what it is that you are sending out there, looking at, whatever? Do you want more of that? On this coming Thursday, they're going to have a meeting of the commissioners of the FCC, and the chairman, Tom Wheeler, is expected to present the Title II classification of internet service providers. That means that companies offering internet services would be regarded and regulated the same as those offering telephone services. Do you want the government in yet another part of your life? What it would do is give the FCC an incredible amount of power in crafting rules to guarantee certain, quote-unquote, marketplace behavior in a way that protects consumers, unquote, wrote Wheeler in a Wired article detailing the plan this month. Whatever the government says, we want to get involved, we want to protect you a little bit more, I immediately see antennas growing up, and I start filtering all of that. I want to delve into that this morning. There's a 332-page document sent out from the Obama administration about this internet neutrality, which would be anything but neutrality or neutral. Phil Kerpen is the president of American Commitment. He's been with us before here on the Gary Sutton Show, and he joins us this morning. Hey, Phil, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Gary. One minor correction. They have not released the 332-page plan. It is a secret document.
Right.
They are going to vote on it before anyone outside of the commission sees it. And
yeah, so it
was developed in the White House. It was sent over to the FCC, but they refused to release it to the public.
Right, exactly. And I meant to say it was sent to the FCC. And obviously, but in the most open and transparent administration so far, I'm sure we'll see it very soon before they would vote on it, right?
They've said that they will not release it prior to the vote. We're hoping that they'll release it shortly after the vote. But even that, they could wait weeks, they could wait months. So we don't know when we'll actually see it, which is kind of amazing because back in 2007, when the FCC was working on media ownership rules and a lot of the liberal activist groups were up in arms and so forth, then Senator Obama sent a very strong letter over to the FCC saying, you must make this proposal public and allow public comments. Don't do it in secret. And now the shoe's on the other foot, as it were, and now he wants to get it done as covertly as possible.
Was that similar to when the president said, "I don't have the power to pass executive order on immigration," and then did? I mean, I'm being cynical this morning. I'm sorry, I don't mean it, Phil, but it comes up every now and then. It's not even cynical. It's just you say what is. What you say over here doesn't seem to translate into what you do over here. And to me, that is a major problem in our country right now. One of the things that we have found out is that the public neither understands nor necessarily supports this whole FCC voting on net neutrality because they don't know what it means. And a lot of the reason they don't know what it means is because this whole can of worms has not yet been open to the public, right?
Yeah, they put out this they called it a fact sheet, and they basically said, don't worry, it doesn't do anything bad. And
right.
It's kind of like, hey, guys, if it doesn't do anything bad, first of all, why does it take 332 pages to write it out? Number two, why won't you let us see it? And number three, what the heck is the point? What is the problem you're trying to fix? What's wrong with the Internet now? That you need government regulations. And so this whole thing is sort of a bizarre exercise in government regulation for its own sake. They've demonstrated no actual problems that they're trying to fix, and there are going to be major negative implications of this. We don't know all the details, Gary, but we do know that the centerpiece of this, as you mentioned in the opening there, is that they are going to reclassify Internet service, as a public utility, subject to to what's called Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. Which is a little bit out of date, I would suggest, and was designed for the old monopoly AT&T telephone system. And the idea that the Internet has failed as a free market, unregulated network, which is what it's been, and therefore it needs to be regulated like the old telephone system, is so out of touch with reality, it's astonishing that anyone would even propose it, let alone us be poised for them to actually enact it here in a couple of days. And they are going to create the power for these federal bureaucrats at the FCC to decide everything, basically everything that happens on the Internet. They'll get to decide whether they think it's, quote, just and reasonable. And if it's not, they'll be able to regulate it. They'll be able to set prices. They'll be able to prohibit certain network management practices. They'll be able to prohibit different business arrangements, so on and so forth. And it's going to get a lot worse over time, in my judgment, because these types of rules will dramatically decrease private investment. And there was one bipartisan analysis by a consulting firm called Sonicom that found that this will reduce private investment by 20% in just the first 5 years. That private investment that's destroyed by all of the regulations will be replaced with taxpayer dollars, because people are not going to tolerate the Internet sort of not working anymore and sort of slowing down and so forth. So we're going to be forced to pay as taxpayers to make up for the lost private investment, and universal service fund fees at the state and local level and at the federal level. And the state and local taxes that will come with this, according to one think tank study actually from a liberal group, the Progressive Policy Institute, who, by the way, said that this will undo the Clinton-Gore legacy of an unregulated Internet. So I'm wondering, but the media doesn't even ask Hillary Clinton about this, which is amazing to me. They found that it'll increase your bill 12.4% with state and local fees, and that's before we find out if there are going to be any new federal fees, which this plan defers the decision on whether there'll be new federal fees. So I'll break the suspense. There will be, not right away, because they want to be able to say that's not included, but there will be as private investment declines. And what I think is going to happen over the next 10 years or so is you're going to see a lot of tax dollars going in and replacing the private investment that's destroyed by all these regulations. And then you're going to have a lot of these liberal groups clamoring and saying, we need to have public interest regulation. This is a public network that's funded with our tax dollars, and we need to regulate it to make sure that the voices of women and minorities are heard appropriately, and we need to regulate it to make sure opposing viewpoints are heard, and we need to regulate it to have public interest channels and so forth. And it's going to end up looking a lot like TV and radio, and it's going to end up being heavily regulated. And, I do these radio interviews, Gary. Broadcasters like you are the people who really understand this path that we're going down, because they're the people who've actually had to deal with the FCC. And the idea of putting these guys in charge of deciding what's just and reasonable on the Internet is crazy, especially when you consider the Internet is not it's not broken. It doesn't need to be fixed. It's working great.
We're talking with Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment. Phil, you look at this. First of all, I would offer to anybody, go look at your phone bill and see if you like that. If take a look at the number of taxes that you pay and the number of fees that you pay on your phone bill, for starters, and then say, geez, I'd sure love to see that on my Internet bill, because gosh darn it, I just don't feel like I'm paying enough to the government right now, of all the various governments that get a hand in that whole mess. But the second part, which you talked about, is really the scariest part to me, and that is the infringement again upon free speech beyond what we have right now. I mean, we have certain regulations right now on what you can and cannot do, but by the same token, isn't it the idea, or shouldn't it be the idea of government to keep their hands off private industry and private interaction as much as humanly possible? Wasn't that I'm remembering something our founding fathers said, something along the lines of freedom, and every time a little bit more of our freedom is taken, it's a little less freedom that we have, to use a simplistic quotation.
Look, I agree completely with you. I think that, to me, freedom is... freedom means as little government interference as possible. Let people work things out voluntarily.
And the assumption is freedom with responsibility, too, so that's what we're talking about here. Sure.
Of course. The liberals that are pushing for these regulations have a very different conception. They think that companies are evil, that markets are evil, that if government doesn't save us from the big bad phone and cable companies with the strictest possible regulations, then those companies will do all sorts of nefarious things to us. And they tell these scare stories. Now, the reason, they've been talking about this for about 10 years now, saying if government doesn't save us any day, the phone or cable company is going to block what website you can go to and redirect your traffic and cause all this other mischief to destroy the Internet. It never happens because they have to cater to their customers, and they have competitors. And if they ever did these nefarious things, they would have very, very negative business consequences. And so markets work in that regard. But you still get these same scare stories from these liberal groups, and the same desire of government, to basically step in and take things over. And Gary, I'll read you a quote here which I think is very important to understand what this is really all about. This is a quote from a fellow named Robert McChesney. He's a college professor. He was the founder of the biggest liberal advocacy group that's been pushing these regulations for years. He's still a board member there. And he was giving an interview with actually a socialist website in Canada called the Socialist Project. Okay. And he was more candid with them than his group has been typically. And he said, quote, "At the moment, the battle over network neutrality is not to completely eliminate the telephone and cable companies. We are not at that point yet. But the ultimate goal is to get rid of the media capitalists in the phone and cable companies and to divest them from control."
And then the group that you put into control, once again, is the good old government who, again, could screw up a free meal. And again, their idea is to move you around like little Pac-Men and women, and to make sure you see what they want you to see. I'm reminded of Russia and their clamp down on a lot of their. I remember TASS. We used to get all the news from TASS for a while. I mean, the same concept. It's not quite exactly the same, but the same concept could ultimately apply here, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. There's a pretty direct connection to what's happening domestically and some of the international issues, because if we start regulating the Internet in the U.S., even if we say it's only economic regulation, we're not going to touch content. And as I said, I don't think that'll hold for very long. But let's just say it did. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. It still will make it very, very difficult for us to argue internationally that other countries shouldn't be regulating the Internet. It will undermine our diplomatic position. And not just that, but the actual legal reclassification itself, saying that we're going to treat Internet service as a telecommunication service, as a public utility, that automatically triggers international jurisdiction under the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and it's going to be very, very difficult for us to resist international regulatory and governance efforts over the Internet, which we've done a pretty good job of resisting at the UN and the ITU if we move forward with this. And so it's interesting. One of the talking points that we keep getting from the liberals is they say there were almost 4 million comments in the regulatory docket, which shows how important it is for the FCC to act on this. Now, 40% of those comments were opposed to any Internet regulation. They want to ignore that. They want to pretend they all asked for regulation. But it also, I saw one analysis found that there were at least 100,000 comments and possibly many more that were in favor of regulation that actually came from abroad, that actually came from foreigners, not non-U.S. comments. And so you really have to question, what is going on with a process where we're considering comments from abroad as one of the rationales for imposing regulation in the U.S. And
you would misrepresent that information to people, and yet you're the one that wants to tell us that you're the very best that can help take care of our Internet out there. I just got a tweet from one of our listeners who said, "We lose freedom in bits and pieces. We rarely get it back. Beware the noble intentions of those who want to restrict speech." And then he followed up by saying, and when someone offers you a free speech zone, show him the borders of the entire United States. I want to come back with Phil Kerpen to talk a little bit more about this and what it means, this whole idea that is going to be considered on Thursday before the FCC. And by the way, do you like the idea of a small group like the FCC controlling free speech on the Internet ultimately? Because that's ultimately what they would be able to do if they get this little nudge of a door opened here. Yeah, nice thought, huh? In a democracy where we're supposed to have some say over our representatives, and yet once again we head off to another regulatory agency to control us. And you say, you're frightened over nothing. Really? We'll talk more with Phil Kerpen about it when we come back. He's the president of American Commitment here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Every time you go out and complain that we're moving in something else to a regulatory agency, the people who support the government's plan always dismiss it as a myth or even a lie by proponents of the president's plan. No, who could possibly think any of that will ever come about? You couldn't possibly be losing your freedom, could you? Well, Phil Kerpen's a president of American Commitment. He's been with us here this morning. Phil, I keep hearing people say all the time, well, the government's good. The government will take care of it. They're the referee. They're the arbiter. They'll do right by us. Are they doing right by us so far when they get involved in our lives through all these various regulatory agencies, and most of them aimed at hurting private enterprise, which is, to me, the authentic way that we set our prices and that we do things here in America? It's the only authentic way, and everything that the government does seems to me to be artificial and manufactured in so many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, anyone who still thinks that government is usually helpful hasn't been paying attention, I don't think. And, I think we need to be especially wary of a plan that's so good that they don't want to show it to us.
Yeah, I mean, if I go out and I say to you, Phil, I'm gonna fix your car, and I'm gonna give you 30 extra miles an hour than you have right now. Your first question might be, Gary, how are you going to do that? Well, no, trust me. Just trust me, Phil. You don't know me, but you know that everything I touch turns to gold, and I'll take care of that for you. And you go, yeah, but I mean, is there anybody out there in the sounds of our voices, Phil, that deals that way, that doesn't ask questions about what it is that we're going to have done? And yet they continue to say to us, well, we're the most open and transparent administration ever, and just trust us, right? And yet we've been lied to so many different times, and we've seen so many different places where over here you said you were going to do this, and over here you did something else. I mean, what proof is there that they are going to do anything here? And every time you open one of these doors, it goes to a slippery slope.
Yeah, and well, the thing that drives me nuts, Gary, is we've seen this time after time after time where these big government policies are suggested and they're sold to us on all these wonderful promises, and then the reality ends up being something completely different. And yet the media keeps repeating all their claims as if they were true. And
right.
So I get all these stories in the media. There was an article in Politico today, which is a liberal blog
Sure.
masquerading as a newspaper, where they attacked me for saying that this plan is a federal takeover of the internet. They said, "Oh,
right.
no, that's not true at all." Well, it is true. Look at their own words. I mean, I just read that quote from you, of the leading group that's pushing for this, what their end goal is, which I sent to him, and he, of course, doesn't mention that in his article. And so, you have this situation where, the regulators say these are our wonderful good intentions. None of the bad things that people are warning about will ever happen. And then you've got sort of corrupt liberal media that just sort of writes that down as stenographers and takes it at face value.
You know what troubles me?
Contract.
What troubles me most of all, Phil, I think when this guy attacked you today in Politico, I think he's attacking you honestly, because what he's saying is our thought about what free speech is not the same as what Phil Kerpen thinks free speech is. And I would offer that these people see free speech as that speech which is popular among their particular side. You and I look at free speech and say, okay, free speech is that which is popular and unpopular among people throughout the country. There are things that are out there. I remember Larry Flint in Flint versus Flint and Jerry Falwell, Flint versus Falwell. And the Supreme Court coming out and saying, listen, if the Constitution and the amendments protect me, a pig like me, it will protect all of you. The idea is that we are supposed to be protecting unpopular and popular speech, not just that speech which happens to be approved by the government. And that's kind of what we're getting down to. And the idea that how many members are on the FCC? Is it 5?
Yeah, it's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans.
There you go. So whoever's in power at that particular time decides what free speech is going to look like. I'm not sure that I'm ready to turn my rights over to 5 people and then controlled by one at the top called the President of the United States.
Yeah, I want to read you one more quote, and this is one that I have in the article that's on our website right now at AmericanCommitment.org. This is a quote from a former Democratic member of the FCC who's now on the board of one of these liberal outside groups that are pushing for these regulations. It's a guy named Michael Copps.
Right.
And when he was on the FCC and he was asked about whether economic regulation would lead to content control, this is what he said. He said, quote, "Can you tell me that minority and women's voices on the internet are getting through to major audiences, really being heard like the big corporate sites? Should we just take it for granted that the small d democratic potential of new information technologies will somehow be magically realized without questions being raised about how they are designed and managed?" Close quote. Now, to me, that says that they are going to use economic regulation, like what's in the president's plan, specifically to try to promote certain voices, in particular liberal voices. And, that is content control to me. That is putting a thumb on the scale. And the fact that rather than rule it out, he sort of implied that that's exactly what they intend to do, means that when the liberal media tells you I'm lying when I say economic regulation is going to lead to content control, they're the ones who are being extraordinarily naive. It's right in front of us where these people want to go with this.
So much like products, that which cannot be sold in the free market will now be force-fed to you in a closed market where they are going to determine that you're going to put this on the same page with the other stuff that is selling. And the other part of that is, and I often say this on my show, ridiculousness and reasonableness will be allowed to be put on the same stage ultimately, even though that ridiculousness seems ridiculous to a lot of us. It's going to be ridiculousness that is sanctioned by the federal government. Is that a fair way of saying it?
I think so.
At least potentially. I mean, not that the government would ever do that.
But my point, Gary, is why even risk it? Why take one step down that path when there's no problem with the way the Internet works now? Not one. It's been a huge success.
Not if you're protecting, defending, and keeping sacred the Constitution of the United States, which I think a few people swore to do up there in the evil empire. Phil, it's always good having you on. I appreciate it this morning. We're going to keep our eye on Thursday and see what happens with this nice, open, and transparent document and what the FCC decides to do with it. I hope they choose not to go down this very, very thorny path, and we'll see what happens. Thanks so much, Phil, as always, for being with us. I look forward to our next time soon.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
Thank you. Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment, with us on the Gary Sutton Show. When we come back, we delve into yet another thing that is happening out there. President Obama's name's on an awful lot of things here this morning. I apologize, but, if he wouldn't involve himself in so much of our lives, maybe we wouldn't be talking about him quite so much. Michael Cutler is a former INS agent for 30 years, a senior fellow with CAPS. And we're going to get into the impasse on the DHS, Department of Homeland Security funding. What is going to be done? What should be done? Michael's got some serious thoughts on that. He is one of the foremost voices on immigration in this country. He'll be with us here on the Gary Sutton Show right after this on News Radio 910 WSBA.